Hello, friends. I miss you very much. I wish I could be with you in person, but it's always a privilege to be able to share my research and my work with you, and I very much look forward to doing that and also to having your questions and discussion later on. So the topic of my presentation today is, as the pendulum swings, with a question mark, the politics of crime policy in San Francisco. So what I will be talking about are recent oscillations back and forth in the crime policy of the city and county of San Francisco, California, particularly as represented in the 2019 election of a man by the name of Chesa Boudin as district attorney, followed in 2022 by his recall and removal from office before the expiration of his normal 4-year term. Now, Boudin had run as a progressive prosecutor, promising fundamental reforms to local crime policy. So the question that has arisen is, what, if anything, does his recall indicate for the future of progressive prosecution in San Francisco, but equally importantly, throughout the United States? I believe that the recall does not signify a broad public retreat from progressive prosecution, which still enjoys wide support in many locales throughout the country, but instead reflects mostly singular characteristics of the San Francisco political environment, coupled with the unique impacts of the COVID pandemic. So still, it represents one variant of the fierce, organized opposition that progressive prosecution has faced everywhere it has been implemented. And therefore, it might offer some lessons for how to forge ahead with reform measures against determined political resistance. Now, I want to begin by sharing with you some salient characteristics of San Francisco, which you may or may not know, but which are directly pertinent to this topic. So first of all, at 47 square miles and with somewhere between 800,000 and 900,000 residents, San Francisco is one of the most densely, it is actually the second most densely populated city in the country following New York City. Second, its economy is greatly dependent on tourism, both recreational and business tourism, business conventions and the like, and also on the many commuters who flood into the city on a daily basis, like I did for all of my career, work in the city and then go home to neighboring communities. Third, San Francisco has a dwindling black population. It was 13% of the city in 1970. It's now down to 5%. Okay, that's important. And then there is, in contrast, a durable, long-standing, well-organized, and politically influential Asian American community of about 34%. And then finally, what I want to say is that the city, San Francisco, occupies a particular place in the national political narrative. It has for long been seen as one of the most liberal and progressive cities in the country, and as a trendsetter in many ways. Same-sex marriage, for example, in 2004, then Governor Gavin Newsom recognized same-sex marriage first in the country, and then, of course, that spread across the country. It has also served as a launching pad for politicians. Politicians get their start in San Francisco and then go on to leadership at either the state level, like Newsom, governor back in 2004, mayor of the city of San Francisco in 2004, governor of the state of California now, okay? Also, Kamala Harris, our current vice president of the United States, she started her political career as the DA of San Francisco, went on to become the attorney general of the state, then the senator for the state of California, and then finally to the vice presidency. So what happens in San Francisco has national reverberations. Now, we here in this area generally are proud of this role, and San Francisco people, San Franciscans, take pride in their trend-setting and leadership role. However, to the right wing and to conservative states and cities throughout the country, and for national politicians as well, San Francisco is regarded with scorn and horror as sort of the worst you can possibly imagine. And of course, San Francisco, like other major cities, does have its problems, particularly with severe income inequality and homelessness and the like. And so the right wing is not without its evidence in looking to it holding up San Francisco as a negative example of where we should be going as a nation. Now, before diving into a sort of a detailed consideration of the Boudin administration and what happened under his roughly 2.5 years in office, I want to say one other thing about what progressive prosecution is all about and how it has emerged as a movement in this country. So, progressive prosecution is primarily a response to the phenomenon in this country, of mass incarceration and racial inequity in the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration, as you may know, we, with something like 2.1 million people behind bars, have the greatest absolute number of people in prison and the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. And there are great racial inequalities in this whole scheme of mass incarceration. And as I have argued to you in the past and cited to you the work of Michelle Alexander, there are many people who believe, in fact, that this mass incarceration is all about race. It is the current means of maintaining white supremacy in the United States and keeping, in particular, black and brown people in a subordinate status in this country. So progressive prosecution in its various forms, and it's not all the same in every place, is about reversing this through a variety of different kinds of reforms. And I think it's fair to call this a movement, partly because it sees itself as such. It is organized through various organizations, national in scope and state. Some of them are state-based. They see each other as comrades in a common struggle, and with progressive prosecutors now in place in San Francisco, Boudin now recalled, but Los Angeles, Orlando, Florida, Chicago, Illinois, and Seattle, Washington, a number of countries have elected progressive prosecutors, to the point that now tens of millions of Americans, Philadelphia actually is another very important one, tens of millions of Americans are now living within jurisdictions that are administered by progressive prosecutors. Okay, and then one other thing about progressive prosecution is that the whole sort of movement turns on the reality of prosecutorial discretion. In the American legal system, in San Francisco and everywhere else, there is this idea, this ideal, and a reality that that prosecutors exercise virtually unbridled, unbounded discretion over decisions about who to charge, what crimes to charge, whether to charge at all, how to charge, and the like. So this power over charging is an immense power. It's an awesome power, and it has led many commentators, academic and otherwise, to the view that prosecutors are the most powerful officials in the criminal justice system. Okay, so for progressive prosecutors, this is a prize. If in fact traditional prosecutors have been one of the causes of mass incarceration, then one of the means of reversing mass incarceration is to seize these positions of special power and to exercise them in a different direction toward what might be called decarceration, which is, the opposite of mass incarceration. So that's what the progressive prosecution movement is about. It is Chesa Boudin, when he was elected in 2019, was not the first progressive prosecutor in San Francisco. We have had a series of prosecutors, and the movement has been increasingly in the direction of progressive prosecution. It started off actually in the mid-90s, and we've kind of gradually migrated toward more and more progressive DAs, with Chesa Boudin being the most. Now, when Chesa Boudin was elected in San Francisco, he brought a very unusual pedigree to the office of the district attorney. His parents had been members of a leftist organization, which got involved in an armed robbery. They were actually just getaway drivers. They didn't pull any triggers, but they were getaway drivers. And in this armed robbery, it was of a Brinks armored car, carrying cash. Three people were killed, 2 police officers and 1 Brinks guard. And the parents, Chesa Boudin's parents, were apprehended, and they under felony murder principles, which are, if you commit a felony and in the process of that felony anybody is killed, you can be charged with murder whether or not you actually pulled the trigger. So they both went to prison. And Chesa, from the age of 14 months, was raised by foster parents, and he lived his life visiting his parents in custody behind bars. So he was the son of incarcerated parents. He obtained an absolutely stellar academic training. Went to Yale Law School, widely regarded as the best or one of the best law schools in the country. He came out to San Francisco and started working in the public defender's office, and litigated one of the most influential and important cases that has come down in the state of California in decades. It was called In Re Humphrey, and it had to do with a challenge to our cash bail system. I'm not going to digress to explain what cash bail is all about. I don't think I have time, but please ask me about it in discussion if you're curious. So when he took over in 2019 as district attorney, imagine he is suddenly in charge of the very same attorneys that he had been facing as adversaries in court for the previous number of years. And to, I would say, aggravate this, he fired some highly respected prosecutors from the office, and then built his management team, including additional former members of public defenders from his old office. So, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but you can imagine that if you were in the Russian army today and all of a sudden there were a house cleaning and you found yourself being commanded by a bunch of Ukrainian generals, you'd be questioning that, let's say. So this is, kind of what happened here in San Francisco. Now, this kind of house cleaning is actually not unique. When new district attorneys come in, it's pretty common for them to fire a bunch of people and hire a bunch of their people, their own management team who see things the way they do and who will help them administer as they want. And it has been particularly so of when progressive prosecutors have come into office in other places. For example, Larry Krasner, who was elected in Philadelphia, fired 31 attorneys within days of his first election in, I think it was 2017. So this is not unusual, this kind of turnover, but it continued, and the churn in the office eventually resulted over the 2.5 years of Boudin's administration in 51 prosecutors, approximately a third of the office, either resigning or being fired. And you can imagine that few organizations can withstand that degree of turnover without disruption. And keep in mind that this was all occurring during COVID. So, all of this stuff, the challenge of building a new culture was being done virtually, which you can from your own experiences, you can infer how difficult that would be. Now, like I said, Boudin was preceded by another progressive prosecutor. His name was George Gascon, and I mention him by name because I'll be referring to him again later. Gascon actually resigned from San Francisco as DA and then went down to Los Angeles and ran for election for DA down there and won, and is now the DA of Los Angeles County. Nonetheless, there is little question that the policies that Boudin began to implement, they were perfectly consistent with his campaign promises. They were consistent with what one might call the playbook of progressive prosecution. So what couldn't have been a surprise to the voters of San Francisco. But they represented a fairly abrupt shift from the policies of his predecessor. So most of them had to do with the broad policy. The specific policies were expressions of a broad commitment to decarceration, which, as I've already said, is the opposite of incarceration. So getting people out of custody or not putting people in custody. And this was thoroughgoing, right? It ranged across the entire spectrum of criminal prosecutions, from decisions not to charge cases at all, to decisions not to seek bail, so to allow people to stay out of custody prior to trial after they had been charged, to diverting people out of the criminal justice system to various forms of rehabilitation and treatment, and suspending criminal proceedings. If they complete their treatment, the case goes away, gets dismissed, to seeking non-carceral dispositions in plea bargaining. So when people did get convicted, they either didn't spend time in custody or they spent less time in custody, to seeking lower sentences after conviction at trial. And then Boudin even created a unit in the office to go back and to review cases of people who had already started serving their time, to review those cases to see if either sentences were too extreme or whether there were any problems in the legality and the quality of the evidence on which the convictions were based. And some of these cases were reversed or people were allowed out of custody. So decarceration was a major theme in the Boudin administration. As I've said, another animating principle of the progressive prosecution movement as a whole, and certainly of Chesa Boudin's administration, was racial equity. Now, this is intertwined with the problem of mass incarceration, because mass incarceration vastly, disproportionately impacts black people and other people of color, but really primarily black people. So some of the policies of, some other policies, I should say, of Boudin's were directly aimed at establishing racial equity. And I think that's what you could say of his, of a number of measures that he took, and I'd be happy to give you more details about them, about the question of police accountability, right? So directly following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May of 2020, Chesa Boudin introduced a number of policies to deal with instances of police misconduct and to actually charge police with crimes when they used force unjustifiably against against civilians. So Boudin his office was the first nationally, I believe, and he maintains, to charge officers with homicides. There were 2 of them, so it was the first 2 cases, charged homicides against officers for actions that they took on duty. And of course, the victims in both of these cases that Boudin brought were black. So one other thing that all of this, like I said, consistent with the the general commitments of progressive prosecution. One very unusual thing that he did was to establish what he called the Economic Crimes Against Workers Unit. He did this within 4 months of taking office, and apparently it was the first of its kind the first of its kind in the United States. And in 2021, the unit brought a path-breaking set of civil suits against the food delivery service DoorDash and then another corporation for misclassifying gig workers. Now, you may know that gig workers are people who are treated in the law here in California and much of the rest of the states as independent contractors by their major companies, Uber, Lyft. There are a number, Instacart, that all sort of operate on this business model. And the reason they do that, of course, is because the corporations are not obligated to pay benefits for gig workers as independent contractors, right? There's a lot of employment law that requires employees to take care of employees and to respect their rights in various ways, provide health care, et cetera, et cetera. Few of those obligations are owed to independent contractors. So, this suit against DoorDash, one of these gig worker companies, really sort of hit at the heart of the business model of a number of major San Francisco corporations. And then, as a sort of another theme in Boudin's administration and also in other progressive prosecutors, it is the effort to address the root causes of crime, to prevent crime, so that you don't even have people appearing in the criminal justice system, and so this was he did this through a suit against a number of out-of-state corporations that provided parts for what we call here in the United States ghost guns. These are guns that are made often out of stamped plastic and other such materials. There are different ways that they can be produced. They can be produced at home solely from entirely from scratch, but you can also purchase over the internet parts and then assemble them at home. And home manufacture of weapons has never been regulated in the United States, whereas, of course, standard manufacture is regulated heavily, relatively heavily, not heavily enough, but home building is not regulated at all. So these guns are completely untraceable, and they have become, that's why they're called ghosts, because you can't see them, you can't track them down. Right? These guns have become increasingly popular among the, I don't like to call them criminal class, but they are involved, they are employed in crime. Now, when Chesa Boudin took office in January of 2020, nobody could have predicted how rapidly and radically life in San Francisco, as everywhere else in the world, of course, would shift just 9 weeks later. But it did with the institution of a regional stay-at-home order on March 16th of that year due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So residents of the entire Bay Area were required to stay indoors, to venture out only for essential purposes, and not to travel more than 5 miles from our residences. And this went on until May of 2020. restrictions, as you know, I mean, like many other places, were gradually loosened, but they actually haven't even disappeared to this day. We still have certain kinds of restrictions, indoor masks, and the like, and sometimes they go away for a while, then they come back. So very, very, very disruptive. It's such a platitude to say, but this impact, the social, economic, and political impact of the pandemic, were unlike, I would say, anything that this country has faced since perhaps World War II or the Great Depression in the 1930s. So, imagine this city so dependent on tourism, both from abroad and from other parts of the United States. And, it's a regional shopping hub, and it's a regional employment hub. So, hundreds of thousands of people would commute into the city on a daily basis. All of a sudden, all of this overnight comes to a stop, right? And the downtown of San Francisco is a complete ghost town. One difference between us and New York is that we don't have much of a mixture of commercial and residential areas. In New York, you live in a high rise and the bottom has stores and the like. Not in San Francisco. It is our financial and business district is almost exclusively commercial with very few residents. So the area was completely abandoned almost. Hotels and restaurants were all closed. Tourism, as I said, ground to a complete halt. And I'm not going to go into. I mean, there are many different ways in which the pandemic imposed unprecedented stresses on our lives. You all experienced it, so I won't go into it. Let me just, a couple of things to note are that homeless shelters in San Francisco were shut down. We have a very substantial problem of homelessness in San Francisco. It's one of the worst in the country. And it was exacerbated by the fact that these shelters, these nighttime shelters, were shut down. And so all that many more people in the streets. Same with jails. So, for the safety of prisoners, many were released into the community sooner than they would have, in essentially accelerating Boudin's decarceration policies, but on account of the pandemic. Now, let me turn to the impact of the pandemic specifically on crime patterns in the criminal justice system. It had very unpredictable and fascinating impacts. Not surprisingly, with most people at home and remote workers not commuting into the city. I mean, and this continued because remote work became an alternative, and people didn't return to commuting for a long time. Still have not. Perhaps not surprisingly, the overall crime rate in San Francisco plummeted. It went down. This was true of crimes in almost all categories, including violent crime. There were some exceptions. One was home burglaries, which skyrocketed by 50%. And then murders also increased by 17%. With respect to murders, however, consider that that only represented, in absolute terms, 8 more deaths in 2020 than in 2019. San Francisco is a kind of middling city in terms of crime overall, including violent crime, as compared to other cities in California, and especially as compared to cities in the eastern United States, where Chicago, for example, famously has a very, very serious problem of gun violence. San Francisco doesn't have that. So we went from 41 murders in 2019 to 49 murders in 2020. These are all lives. I don't mean any disrespect, but that's a relatively small increase as compared to other cities. And then the rate, the percentage of of murders in other cities, including those nearby, like Sacramento, which is about 90 miles away from here, and has a conservative prosecutor, not a progressive prosecutor. The rates of violence there increased at a much higher rate. Some estimate between 26 and 35% increase in murders in other cities. Sorry, I'm going to turn my blind a little here. So, so that, you know, there was an uptick in murders, but as compared to other places, not really that great. Now, where crimes were occurring and who were the targets of crimes also shifted, and this is very, very important. It used to be, I mean, you know, when I talk about the economy of San Francisco being dependent on tourists and commuters, I'm not just talking about the formal economy, I'm also talking about the criminal economy. So, you know, criminals, people who depend for their livelihoods on regular engagement in crime, have traditionally focused on shopping areas where people leave, you know, their goods that they've just purchased in their cars, you know, while they go on continue having lunch or to other stores. They have also focused on tourists who come in with their cash, with their fancy cameras, and generally speaking are, you know, identifiable by their language, by their appearances, by their clothing, etc. And they have always been a favorite target of crime in San Francisco for all of those, you know, all of those things that they bring with them, and also for the fact that you know, if a person gets apprehended in, let's say, a street robbery of a Japanese tourist, that person knows that, you know, because, you know, these people, I mean, I'm saying this because I'm just sharing with you things that my own clients as a public defender would share with me. They knew that these people would not be flown back here to testify against them at a preliminary hearing at great cost to the district attorney. And therefore, you know, if they got caught, the odds of their case being dismissed before trial were fairly high. Okay, so, you know, I mean, these people are no longer in the city. So what are you going to do if you depend on crime for your survival? You don't stop. You have to go elsewhere, and that's what happened. So what happened was that car break-ins, which had been concentrated in these shopping and tourist areas, suddenly spread to residential neighborhoods, including wealthy residential neighborhoods that had suffered far fewer of them before the pandemic. And then home burglaries also were almost certainly due to the abrupt halt in tourist commuter traffic into the city. So if you think about it, this is a very significant shift, because what this meant is that a greater proportion of the burdens of property crimes went from non-voting tourists and commuters to San Francisco homeowners and renters who voted in the city. And of course, the intrusiveness and threat associated with home burglaries is considerably greater than was so of car burglaries. Another phenomenon that occurred during the pandemic was the uptick in what have widely been perceived to have been anti-Asian hate crimes, a high proportion of them, sadly, committed against elders. This was in keeping with national trends again. There was a 77% increase in reports of crimes against Asian Americans from 2019 to 2020. Now, this phenomenon has been widely explained as COVID-driven, fueled, unfortunately, by President Trump's repeated references to Kung flu and to the China virus and the like. And let me remind you here that this impacted San Francisco's 34% Asian population, and there were some highly publicized crimes that the that the media feasted on that occurred during 2020, 2021. Now, San Francisco criminal justice, the system, was not spared the disruption of the pandemic. Judges, court staff, attorneys for both prosecution and the defense, jurors, all of them were subject, all of us were subject to the stay-at-home order just like any other citizen. So it was weeks, if not months, before the courts could gear back up. They adapted awkwardly to virtual proceedings, causing lengthy delays in trials. Virtual tools, provided a stopgap to trials and other ancillary services like Alcoholics or Narcotics Anonymous meetings. Better than nothing, but far less effective than in-person encounters. Now let me take a look at the recall effort and see if I can tease out for you why I think the recall effort was successful. So, first of all, recalls are the removal of public officials from office before the legally prescribed term that they would serve, absent the recall. And California and a few other states, I believe 18 other states, have recall provisions. They were an innovation of the early 20th century progressive era, and they, along with what are called referenda, referendum, singular, referenda, plural if you go by the Latin, they were both conceived of as means of direct democracy. This was at a time of political corruption, distrust of elites, and the like. Historically, they have been fairly rare, but they have been increasing in number and popularity, and we see more and more of them. And ironically, what began as originally conceived of as a means of direct democracy has been captured by special interests, and especially moneyed interests. So, the people that these measures were originally targeted against have figured out a way to make use of them. And a lot of this has to do with the procedure. The way a recall works is that a number of citizens first file a notice. It's called a notice of intent here in California. Once it starts, it kind of starts the clock ticking on a window of time, and within that window of time, a certain number of signatures, and that what the number is kind of depends on the jurisdiction and the like. So a certain number of signatures have to be gathered, they have to be certified, and then if the requisite number is reached within that time window, the issue is the recall or the referendum is placed on the ballot for a special election. So why did the 2022 recall of Chesa Boudin succeed? So there's no single factor, but a multitude of factors which produce this, I would say, exceptional result. So first of all, San Francisco's small geographic scale, 47 square miles, and high population density made a recall more logistically and financially feasible than it would have been in a larger jurisdiction. Compare San Francisco, for example, to Los Angeles County. I mentioned to you that we have under 1 million people in San Francisco, 47 square miles. Los Angeles County is 4,723 square miles. In other words, 100 times as big as San Francisco, and has nearly 10 million people. So, the recall against Chesa Boudin had to gather 50,000 signatures. The recall, there have been now 2 recall attempts against George Gascon since he took office in Los Angeles. They had to gather 566,000 signatures, and they both failed. Okay, so a recall was simply more attainable, more within reach, especially for a well-funded, organized effort. And the recall against Boudin was indeed organized and funded by a relative handful of wealthy opponents. So $7 million was spent in support of the recall, the yes vote. So let's remove Chesa Boudin from office. 80% of that $7 million came in donations of $50,000 or greater, and 3 individuals donated more than $500,000 each. One is reported to have donated nearly $1 million. Meanwhile, fewer than 10% of the recall campaign donations were under $10,000. So rich people funded the recall. The no campaign that supported Chesa Boudin's continuation in office pulled in just $3 million, and its donations were vastly of a much higher proportion of smaller donations. Now, I think I did not mention at the beginning that Chesa Boudin was elected by a relatively narrow margin of 51 to 49%. He ran against a more moderate Democrat and barely prevailed. Now compare this to the point being that he began with probably a narrower and weaker foundation, not as great a mandate as progressive prosecutors have in other places. Compare, for example, Larry Krasner, who I've mentioned several times now, the DA elected first in 2017, then again in 2021 in Philadelphia. He won his first race by 50 points, and then he won his second race by 38 points. So, much stronger mandate to begin with than Boudin had. And note that strong mandates have been given to progressive prosecutors in cities with much larger black populations than San Francisco. Our 5%, Philadelphia is 41%, and Los Angeles is 9%. So, if you consider the fact that mass incarceration has been primarily inflicted on our black community, it's not a surprise that progressive prosecutors have gained the greatest strength in places where that the impact of mass incarceration is most viscerally felt, and that is within cities with a strong black minority. Now, it may be that San Francisco is a very progressive city when it comes to gay rights and to drug policies, but it may be that the support for progressive prosecution may have been thinner than it was wide. In other words, many San Franciscan voters may have supported criminal justice reform in the general and the abstract, while having reservations about concrete reformist measures, especially a robust decarceration strategy. There is an expression, by the way, a Democrat, that's Democrat being generally more liberal, progressive, a Democrat is a Republican who hasn't been mugged and who hasn't been a victim of a street crime. In other words, each progressive or liberal is one crime away from changing their perspective entirely. Now, there were a couple of very high-profile incidents, crimes that were that were committed in the city in 2020 and 2021 that were greatly amplified, especially by both social media, by private citizen, and also by the legacy media, by mainstream newspapers. Let me just read you a headline that came from our local CBS. That's one of the local television stations. Here's the headline: victim in brutal Chinatown attack sues San Francisco DA Chesa Boudin amid shocking jump in anti-Asian hate crimes. Okay, so the media, we to share another common expression with us. This is common in American journalism. If it bleeds, it leads. In other words, audiences respond to reports of crime, and so newspapers and television stations lead with reports of crime. It turned out in this particular case that many of the facts that had been claimed by the victim were actually untrue. And this suit that I referred to, it was a civil suit that was filed against Boudin, because he didn't charge a hate crime in this case, and then he negotiated a fairly moderate plea bargain for the defendant. The plaintiff in the civil suit, the Asian gentleman, withdrew the suit because it turned out that actually much of what he had claimed in the suit was false. But this thing went on for almost 2 years during almost the entire pendency of Boudin's administration, leaving the impression that he was completely insensitive to Asian American concerns. There was another major case in which a parolee, somebody who had been released from prison, committed a series of crimes that culminated in the killing of 2 innocent pedestrians, people walking in the city, and he was driving drunk. He had a gun in his car, he had methamphetamines, and he ran them over and killed them. Very, very sad, very tragic event. And of course, this guy had committed several crimes in San Francisco. They were minor crimes, they were nonviolent crimes, and what Boudin did, instead of filing new charges against him, Boudin, his office, referred this man to the California Department of Corrections. That's standard practice. It has been for decades. It used to go on when I was a public defender back, 30 years ago. It's also standard in other jurisdictions. The reason we do it is because California Department of Corrections, they're the ones who deal with issues of parole violations. They are very streamlined, very quick, very inexpensive, and it's a much more expedient way to send a person back to prison than filing a new case, which consumes a lot of resources, takes a lot of time, and the like. So, Boudin got blamed for pursuing a policy that everybody follows, but because this guy then went out and sadly killed a couple of people, Boudin was blamed for it. Now, let me say, and I'll be winding down shortly, by no means was the resulting anger and frustration of San Francisco voters directed exclusively at Chesa Boudin, at their district attorney. In fact, 3 members of the San Francisco Board of Education were recalled in February 22 over a series of actions that they had taken that I won't go into the details unless you want me to later. These 3 members of the board were recalled. And extensive polling done by the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the leading newspaper in San Francisco, directly after the recall, showed deep despair, anger, frustration toward all city officials, the mayor, the board of supervisors, the school board, everybody. People were fed up with the lack of progress on major problems that the city is facing. So I think it is not an exaggeration to say that had other city officials been, if their necks had been put on the chopping block instead of Boudin's, voters might have swung the axe with as much force as they did on Boudin, and he became the lightning rod for frustration and anger against city government writ large. It is not an accident, of course, that it was Boudin who was targeted by these moneyed interests, and not, for example, the mayor. The mayor, whose name is London Breed, she's a centrist Democrat. She's friendly to business interests. Boudin had showed his hand in these suits against the major corporations, and so he was not friendly to business interests. So it was, like I said, not a mistake that he was the one targeted, not other city officials. Now, there's no question that Boudin faced internal resistance from deputies within his office, and that was the cause of all of that churn that I described earlier. Now, like I said, also, this is absolutely typical. This is what happens when somebody takes over a prosecutor's office, and you have this long tradition of prosecutors who have been there, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, all operating under the kind of traditional tough on crime mentality. And you have this new person comes in with a different philosophy and a different approach and a different set of policies. Of course, people are going to resist. So that actually is, George Gascon, for example, in Los Angeles, the union representing his deputies has sued him in court for his attempts at reform. So the resistance that Boudin faced from within is not the reason that he was recalled. Gascon, as I already mentioned, too, has survived 2 recall attempts in Los Angeles, notwithstanding this revolt from his deputies. However, what the internal resistance did provide was an opening for outside forces. There were 2 deputies in particular who resigned from Boudin's office, who had been in the office before he arrived, and they became vocal spokespeople. The 2 of them became vocal spokespeople, interviewing with television, appearing in political ads and the like. And so this gave a sort of an inside lever to the forces in support of recall. It's also the case, likely, that Boudin was undermined deliberately by the police. I'm checking my time and thinking that perhaps I need to leave that for discussion. But, basically, let me just say quickly that police were not making arrests, and they were telling civilians, this is, somebody calls them up, somebody's stealing the catalytic converter of my car. I can see them out there right now. They're sawing away and about to run off with this catalytic converter. So the police show up, they have the guy, and then they don't make arrest. And then they tell the homeowner, this DA that we have now, he's not going to file cases. Nothing's going to happen to this guy anyway. Why should we bother arresting him? So there was that kind of resistance. I'm going to just say that the mayor, London Breed, also was clearly not on the same page in her policies with Chesa Boudin. I'll just make that bald assertion, have to come back and defend it and provide facts on it in a little bit, if you wish. Now, the final 10-point margin by which the recall succeeded actually was narrower than anticipated. Polling going into the election suggested that Boudin would suffer a resounding defeat. He didn't. But what voting patterns showed and precinct analysis showed was that Boudin was felled essentially by a coalition of Asian American and affluent white voters. If you look at where the votes came from, those are the ones who voted against him. whereas the black community, small though it was, voted largely in support of Boudin in favor of keeping him. Now, a few conclusions. I began by disputing the claim that Boudin's recall signified broad discontent with the goals of progressive prosecution, and saying instead that it was a unique confluence of circumstances specific to San Francisco and the unprecedented impact of COVID on San Francisco particularly that combined to explain this unusual development. I stand by that. Nonetheless, I think that there are some lessons that we can draw. Those of us, like myself, who are interested in seeing the experiment of progressive prosecution through to determine if in reality it offers a better alternative to what we've been doing over decades. There maybe are some things that we can do better differently going forward to avoid this kind of result. So first, don't laugh, but the first is don't try to introduce aggressive criminal justice reform at the beginning of a pandemic. Now, you may think I'm joking. I'm not. But I say this for two reasons. Number one, I say with confidence. Of course, one can never, hindsight is 20/20, but also, you can never prove a counterfactual. So, we can't remove the impact of the pandemic and say what the results would have been. However, I say with confidence that if the pandemic had not occurred, Chesa Boudin would not have been recalled. Not the pandemic, obviously, in itself, but all of the impacts that he had on society. So what, you might say? Okay, well, this is a unique event. It won't happen again. Well, what experts are telling us these days is that we should get used to the possibility that we will be facing pandemics repeatedly in the future. And between climate change and other matters, we are going to face disasters with regularity that may have impacts similar to the pandemic, whether it's floods, earthquakes, or anything else. And so maybe it's not just paranoid to suggest that reformers should tread lightly and carefully under challenging circumstances, which may become our new normal. Understand what the impacts are of these events before charging ahead. Second, what might be called the heroic model of criminal justice reform is not likely to succeed. Yes, prosecutors may be very powerful, but in fact they are downstream actors with respect to crime. Many of the things that are needed, mental health and addiction services, housing, education, jobs, all of those things that are really necessary to address the root causes of crime, prosecutors don't control. So for this reason, it may be advisable to approach reform not only with comprehensive plans, but also to seek to advance them through electoral slates. In other words, candidates for local level offices campaign together on the basis of promises to collaborate in implementing comprehensive plans. I'm almost done. Third, while the urge to fulfill campaign promises is doubtless strong, and I know because I spoke with Chesa Boudin, and this is what he told me, progressive prosecutors must balance that urge to fulfill promises against the virtues of incrementalism. I'm going to just leave that one at that and try to explain later in discussion why I say that. Fourth and finally, as much as progressive prosecutors may desire to work above the political fray, in today's day and age, that simply does not work. Everything that happens, all actions that a progressive prosecutor takes are going to be subject to scrutiny. They're going to be subject to social media exploitation, and they will be lied about and manipulated for political ends by enemies of reform. You can't go into a gunfight with a paperclip. So, to those of us who detest social media like I do, this is a sad reality, but you have to pay as much attention to messaging and counter-messaging as you do to actually forming and implementing policy. Now, I say that for people like me, sympathetic to progressive prosecution, or even simply fascinated, though skeptical of its promise, this is still a hopeful time, even in San Francisco. The person who has been appointed by the mayor on an interim basis to replace Boudin has been proceeding cautiously, rolling back some of his policies in a rather incremental way. I think that it is likely that she will be reelected in the special election that's coming up in November. She's in good standing to do that, and Boudin has elected not to join that election. However, there will be the next scheduled regular election will be in November of next year, in 2023, and I believe if Chesa ran again at that time, there is a decent chance that he could prevail and that he may still have the last word. Thank you. Now, that is with the exception of you. Now you have the last word. You have the opportunity to ask questions, and I really look forward to doing my best to answer them. Thanks so much.